24.1 here is about flowers and how they reproduce. The whole point of flowers, those are the reproductive structures of plants, and they also attract pollinators. So like I said, flowers are reproductive organs. They have 4 different kinds of specialized leaves: sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Lots of different variations with flowers. You can see here just a generic flower. What you have, the sepals are protective leaves that cover the budding flower, the young flower. The petals you're probably the most familiar with. And then the stamens are what produce the pollen. And then the carpel is here inside the ovary. So like I said, sepals are the protective structures for the bud before it opens. Right here. And then petals, which can be brightly colored, attract insects and other pollinators. Stamens are the male parts of the flower. Stamen is made of 2 parts, a filament and an anther. So the filament is the little stalk on which the anther rests. Anthers produce pollen grains, which are the male gametes. The innermost parts are the carpels. They produce and shelter the female ovules. Carpel has a broad base forming an ovary. This is where ovules are formed. The diameter of the carpel as you move up to the top narrows. And that stalk is called the style. And then at the top is a sticky area called the stigma. Kind of sounds like sticky. It's sticky to capture pollen so that the pollination event can happen. Botanists sometimes call a single carpel or several fused carpels a pistil. And that's what you see here. So you probably won't hear carpel too much, you'll hear more often pistil. Angiosperm is just a fancy name for flowering plants. Angiosperms have a life cycle that shows what we call an alternation of generations between diploid and haploid. Male and female gametes live within the tissues of the sporophyte. So here's how this works. The pollen grains are the male parts, like I said. They develop inside the anthers. And just like all the other male meiosis processes, we get 4 haploid spore cells, 4 haploid cells. Each spore undergoes 1 mitotic division to produce 2 haploid nuclei of a single pollen grain. So each pollen grain has 2 sperm cells. These 2 nuclei are surrounded by a thick wall of protection. The female gametes develop inside the carpel, what we've been calling the pistil now. The ovules, which will, when they're fertilized, will become seeds, are protected in an ovary, which is the future fruit. It always freaks my students out. This is one of my favorite times of the year when I tell them or remind them that a fruit is actually a plant ovary. So just like other female meiosis events that we've talked about, a single diploid cell goes through meiosis to produce 4 haploid cells, 3 of which disintegrate. So again, there's only 1 haploid female gamete that comes out of meiosis. In plants, just like in animals. That remaining cell undergoes mitosis, which produces 8 nuclei. These 8 nuclei and the surrounding membrane are called the embryo sac. So the embryo sac that's within the ovule makes up the female gametophyte, the female gamete of the flowering plant. Cell walls form around 6 of the 8 nuclei. One of those 8 is the female gamete, the egg. If fertilization takes place, this egg will fuse with the male gamete to become the zygote, a plant embryo. The pollination event has to happen in order for seeds to form. Seeds contain the baby plants. Pollination is the transfer of pollen to the female portions of the flower. Some are wind pollinated, but most are pollinated by animals. Wind pollination is simply less efficient than animal pollination. So oak trees that are wind pollinated rely on the wind, weather conditions, and then they overproduce like crazy the number of pollen grains to ensure a pollination event will happen. Animal pollinated plants have these adaptations to attract pollinators: bright colors, sweet nectar, and as you can see, this is an albino hummingbird. It's not just a hummingbird, but it's an albino. They have body shapes. This is an example of coevolution. Animals have evolved body shapes that enable them to reach nectar deep within certain flowers. So we have, with a hummingbird, this long skinny beak and a really long skinny tongue to get into the nectar, to reach the nectar of those flowers. Insect pollination is beneficial to insects and the flower itself, obviously, because it provides a source of food to the insect and to the other animals, pollen and nectar. And then, like I said, the plants benefit because there's a pollination event going on. You can see this bumblebee is covered with pollen grains. Insect pollination is more efficient than wind. Insect pollinated plants are more fit. They have a greater chance of reproductive success. So now after pollination, the fertilization event can happen. If a pollen grain lands on the stigma, remember the stigma is the sticky top of the pistil. If a pollen grain lands on the stigma, it will grow a pollen tube. One of the pollen grain's 2 cells divides and forms 2 sperm cells. The other cell becomes the pollen tube. So the generative cell forms 2 sperm cells. The other cell becomes the pollen tube. This pollen tube literally extends down into the ovary of the pistil. So like it says here, the pollen tube grows into the style where it eventually reaches the ovary. Once that pollen tube is created, the 2 sperms swim down the pollen tube and reach an ovule. When fertilization happens, there are 2 events that take place. It's called double fertilization. One of the sperm fuses with the egg, like we know, a zygote. This is what you're familiar with. Sperm and egg come together, and that's the new plant embryo. The other sperm fuses with 2 polar nuclei in the embryo sac to form a triploid cell. This cell will form what's called endosperm, which is the food for the plant embryo. So inside a seed, you have a plant embryo and you have food for the plant embryo, the food-rich tissue known as endosperm. And again, it's triploid. Here's a corn seed. It's a monocot. The endosperm and the embryo of a corn seed are shown. So over here on the left, we have the embryo, this area right here. And then the rest of it, the white area, is the endosperm. I think I may have skipped one slide. Just checking. No. Okay. The endosperm is used to store food, so flowering plants spend very little energy or resources to produce seeds from ovules until double fertilization has actually taken place. The resources that are saved can be used to make many more seeds. Here's another form of reproduction. Some flowering plants can reproduce asexually. This is called vegetative reproduction. A single plant can produce offspring genetically identical to itself by mitosis. It's basically cloning. It does not require gametes, flowers, or fertilization. New plants can grow from roots, leaves, stems, or plantlets, baby plants. A potato is actually an underground stem that can grow whole new plants from buds called eyes. You remember the eyes that we counted in the potato lab in the sprouts? Here's a zoomed in view of it. It's a little baby plant. Strawberry plants send out what we call runners. I would call it a runner. The technical term is stolons. They have nodes that rest on the ground that produce roots and upright stems and leaves. So right here, there's the runner going to the left and the right, but here's the root system down at the bottom. And then the leaf system, the shoot system, up above. These are called stolons. Some cactus species can reproduce by dropping sections of their stems. When a plant or when an animal comes by, part of the plant breaks off, it falls to the ground. These small individuals growing at the base of the larger adults are called clones. This increases the rate of plant reproduction, but we've also talked about with asexual reproduction it doesn't create any variety. They're identical offspring. If the adaptations are good in that offspring, they can rapidly fill a favorable environment. I already mentioned does not produce new combinations. There's no variety. So if the conditions change, that can be a problem. Horticulturists, and this is an example, I guess, of artificial selection, a little bit of genetic engineering as well. To keep plants growing that have desirable characteristics, horticulturists use cuttings or grafting, which is what's shown in this picture, to make many identical copies of a plant or to produce offspring from seedless plants. So this is how we get seedless grapes, seedless oranges, or clementines, things like that. One of the simplest ways to reproduce plants is using its cuttings. What happens is a grower cuts from the plant a length of stem that includes a number of buds containing meristem tissue. Remember, meristem tissue is where growth happens. There's the apical meristem that helps a plant grow taller, and then the vascular cambium creates secondary growth in a stem that allows a plant to grow wider in its stem. So the grower cuts that plant, from that plant, a stem that includes a number of buds. That stem is partially buried in the soil or a mixture of nutrients that encourage root formation. Grafting is another method of propagation that's used to reproduce seedless plants and varieties of wood plants that can't be propagated from cuttings. Grafting happens by taking a piece of stem or a lateral bud, cutting it from the parent plant, and attaching it to another plant as shown. That's what you see going on right there. Grafting only works when the two plants are closely related. You have two citrus trees, lemon tree and an orange tree, you can graft together. Grafting works best when plants are dormant, which allows the wounds created by the cut to heal before new growth starts.